Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me and subscribe to me on Telegram, Twitter, and Facebook, as well as you can support me on Locals, where you can directly engage with the channel. You can also support me on Buy Me a Coffee, Subscribestar, and now also check out my Substack, where I can write and say what I want to say without fear of having my account taken down. So that's definitely something that most people would be interested in seeing who already follow my channel. I can speak a little more freely there, so definitely check me out over there on Substack. Unfortunately, Logos will not be here tonight. It didn't work out. He thought it would, but it didn't. But I'm still here, and we can go through the Foundationalist Manifesto, the politics of future past. This is from Charles Haywood. I had Charles Haywood on a few months ago to discuss our views on technology. And some of that will come up again in this essay. I won't dwell too much on it. You can just watch our video to get a view of where we stand on the issue of technology. But it will be a recurring theme throughout. We have in the chat, we have Minoan and Cyber Ninja Zero. Well, hello, everyone. So hopefully more people show up. Okay, the Foundationalist Manifesto, the Politics of Future Past, June 17th, 2021, Charles Haywood. And the other reason why I'm doing this is not that this... the Moldbug narrative idea is that we read articles, Logos and I read articles live for a reaction video that Moldbug has done. Obviously, these are very old articles, but they're useful to revisit. Seems to be popular. I don't know if it's popular because it's Moldbug that I'm reading, or if it's popular that I'm reading an article and reacting to it. So we'll see. We'll see if reading Charles indicates. My Sutton seems to be somewhat popular, so maybe it is a popular format. So I'm here to experiment and see what that does. So now I'm reading the article. I'm here to give you back your future, like Yeats's golden bird. I will tell you of what is past and passing and to come. Here I offer an exposition of many of my and what should be our political program, both philosophy and movement foundationalism. What is foundationalism? Foundationalism is a reflection of reality, and through recognizing reality, it aims to maximize the chances of both individual and collective flourishing. It is a way forward, not a way back. The 12 pillars of foundationalism outlined here are organic to mankind rather than an artificial means to create a new man or a new type of society. Although foundationalism, when executed, will indeed be a very different type of society from how we live now. And in truth, foundationalism is two things: the renewal of society and the rebuilding anew of a crumbled society, combined with the long-term maintenance of that society. Okay. Foundation does not guarantee happiness. The apokatastasis, the universal reconciliation, is not its concern. It is not an ideology. It does not offer all the answers. What it offers is a positivism for a maximized future. The goal is to all muddle through together to achieve as much human flourishing as reasonably possible, buffering the miseries inherent to human life. Foundationalism offers the members of society a chance for meaning, for transcendence, not through utopian ideology, but through rebasing ourselves in the real. Foundationalism is grounded in what is universally known to be true, or what was once universally known to be true. It does not invent new truths. Thus, it contains a strong bias towards traditional Western knowledge and modes of thought without calcification of application. The asteroid miner who knows his Aristotle and Aquinas and extracts metals to build great works with a picture of Henry the Navigator and his rocket ship. He is a foundationalist. The aim of an interlocking, coherent program is to inspire men of destiny to help those of like mind reorganize one another and to allow us to see when our leaders are on the right path. If enough of us make foundationalism the touchstone of our political action, we will maximize all of our chances for civilizational success. Still, history goes up and down. Good people in charge are followed by bad, and everything is a mix of light and dark. All we can hope for is to have a political system that is based in reality and that encourages virtues among the great and the small, which allows for human flourishing at all levels. Foundationalism is that system. Foundationalism is the politics of future past. It is not a new thing for a new time, informed by the wisdom of the past. Foundationalism is not restorationism. There is no return. The way is shut. What is instead needed is a new thing, just as the Enlightenment was a new thing, and as the flourishing of Western medieval thought was a new thing. Erase the errors and begin again. Foundationalism ushers in this new dawn. Okay, so just as an introduction, this is, I think the word that's doing a lot of work here is, this is not an ideology. It seeks to, the goal is to all muddle through together to achieve human flourishing. So I guess what all of this really amounts to is a sort of like hedge or a set of guardrails, at least as Charles envisions them. Because I think this sentence is doing a lot of work indicating that there's more to be done that hasn't been done yet, and that this stage of the presentation isn't there to do it. That's how I read that, and then this opening paragraph. Why we need a drastic change. I've written extensively elsewhere on what is wrong with the modern world. I will not repeat myself here, although I will in my future both-length exposition of foundationalism, so it will be complete in itself, except to say the path we are on leads to a dead end. There's no shame in admitting this sad fact. The only shame is the foolishness of pretending that history is still moving in a direction it is not. The source of our society's problem is singular, autonomic liberalism, the philosophy of the Enlightenment, which offers a supremely seductive vision. The dream is false. Look around, ye mighty. Western man has tied himself to this millstone, even as it pulls him down to the depths. The dream must end, for it is poison and man cannot flourish until it is broken. Thus, the iron core of foundationalism is that it opposes autonomic liberalism and plans to destroy as foundationalism's first act. Only when the Enlightenment political philosophy based on a false claim of wholesale human emancipation from all unchosen bonds is both gone and wholly discredited is a new thing possible. For if not, the serpent will whisper his sweet lies in men's ears forever, keeping them fixed in the dream become nightmare. Why a wholesale destruction and replacement rather than incremental corrections, we are told, is the prim and proper conservative solution to problems. Because foundationalism does not aim to conserve, it is a wholesale rebellion against the powers of the modern world, which realizes that these powers must be shattered, the world must be broken to clear the way for new growth. But as I say, the demonstration of why this is essential has already been made, and I will not repeat it here. Today, therefore, answers the what of foundationalism, not the why, or other than to say foundationalism is a means for mankind to return to the path of flourishing. All that is the justification we need. So what I perceive to be doing a lot of the work here, and this reference to the Enlightenment will come up again, specifically liberalism, specifically what he calls, autonomic liberalism, so, radical individualism and egalitarianism and things like that. Now, I'll just say that I would disagree with Charles, that that's the fundamental issue we have to solve. And then if we solve this, all the other issues go away. I think I place technology much higher on the list of problems. I'm not going into all the details because you can watch our discussion. I would, in fact, argue, just to say as much as that, the reason why we have individualism and radical individualism at that, and egalitarianism, is pressures from markets and technology. A commodity is a good which is fungible for every equivalent good of the same kind. So if you have a make and model of a car and it breaks, well, if you have a series of spare parts for that make and model of car, it should be fungible for all practical purposes. Financial exchange demands that people be like that too, which is just another way of saying egalitarianism, rubbing off all the differences. Also, machines need cogs that work, and they need to be fungible as well. If cog breaks, you need to have another cog that looks just like it to put it back in. And so I would argue that this problem is too downstream from other more fundamental problems. But yeah, the technology issue, we'll get into a little bit more here because it's a recurring theme within the Foundationalist Manifesto. But for a full treatment of that, you guys can watch my discussion with Charles. The 12 pillars. Foundationalism is a woven thing, weft and warp. It has 12 pillars, key principles on which it is to be built, each one flexible and supporting the others. I discuss each in turn. Because I've written extensively on these topics elsewhere, here I offer the summary principles and rationales, and then direct the reader to lengthier, earlier writings that include more extensive treatment of the theme. Most of these books' reviews are more accurately vehicles for my thought masquerading as book reviews. Thus, I'm not repeating here everything I said before in the interest of keeping the manifesto of a manageable length. However, again, the book-length version of the Foundationalist Manifesto, The Politics of Future Past, will stand completely alone for those who like that sort of thing. Nor should the 12 pillars be thought of as unnecessarily complete, They are guideposts and supports, not the structure of a temple for worship. Times change and new challenges arise. These challenges can be met with the underlying principles of foundationalism, most of all that reality is. The first pillar, space. For a program dedicated to building on the lessons of history, space may seem like an esoteric starting point, but it is not. In a very real sense, space is the crux of all things for the future of man and contains within itself all the seeds of our future flourishing. Insisting on space as critical to human flourishing reflects on underlying reality about what man needs. Space offers place for humans as humans to achieve and excel, to execute the works of man under the eyes of God. This vision informs foundationalism of the quest for space, both as an independent good and as an engine and fortifier of other, more explicitly political elements of the program. By conquering space, I do not mean any very specific accomplishment, which must be determined by the circumstances. I mean the rebirth of a mental attitude that views great deeds achieved through daring and a love of excellence, exemplified by modern achievements in space, as it was exemplified in exploration and conquest during the creation of today's world by the Christian West and only by the West over the past 800 years. Ideally, this would include human beings permanently expanding into space. But that is the most inspirational and the greatest work. But it could also mean any number of other achievements, from greatly expanded robotic probes done for purely scientific purposes to asteroid mining for economic gain. Space, like any unifying goal, also has important cultural benefits. Thus, for example, a new optimism driven by space will encourage people to have more children and to honor those who do, revising the most critical technical problem we face today, underpopulation. The quest for space also will encourage the talented young to direct their talents to productive endeavors where they will receive honor and prestige and away from the destructive or parasitical activities. Furthermore, it will unify to some degree our heterogeneous society. There is neither Jew nor Greek in working together for grand goals. Simply put, space will help to renew our world. Necessarily, scientific, industrial, and technological achievements unparalleled in human history will be both a requirement and a result of conquering space. But actions tending to transhumanism or any that denies human dignity or the laws of God or of nature will be directly and indirectly suppressed, and pseudosciences, including most of what currently passes for so-called science, will be held in contempt. Okay, well, what I'll say here is I don't think technological society has a lot left in it to go to space. Even if it endures in an anemic, weakened form, that won't be enough to go into space. And I also think that if we look at the divisions, now I would agree with Charles that the social divisions impede any such grand project. But then the question is, isn't that putting the cart before the horse? Don't the divisions have to be solved before you put on the grand project? Because to use the grand project as the means to solve the division seldom works in history. The division has to be overcome before. So, I mean, I get the underlying impetus for the first pillar of space. There needs to be some room for human growth and discovery and expansion. I would argue that where we start now is what Henry David Thoreau talked about in Walden, exploring your own soul, exploring the realm of the forms. He says, being a cartographer of your own soul. That's something that could be done right now without any capital investment whatsoever. And then whether or not you believe space is achievable is based on how much you think, Western Civ has left in it in its current form, which I'm very skeptical of, and to a degree, so is Charles. Second pillar, a mixed government of limited ends and unlimited means. The aim of foundationalist government is to allow human flourishing, to implement, in the words of C.S. Lewis, the ordinary happiness of human life. No form of government is perfect, even in the moment, much less over decades or centuries. And no precise structure of government is always better than every other. What is best depends on the times and circumstances, so the structure of foundationalist government will inevitably change over time. What the exact structure will be is not ours to say, but of those who rule at the moment. But for certain, foundationalism will be a mixed government. Long known as the only feasible type of stable government, the new government will be a protector of the collective of society in its spiritual aspect. It will respect the nation as it should be, not reflect the general will. It could be Augustan, a limited dictatorship, and most certainly will be to begin. It could be aristocratic like Venice in its prime. It will not be democratic because that system is unnatural and destructive at scale. The people will not directly command any decision, although some limited franchise and some analog to the Roman tribunes of the people is likely to make sense. All elements of society will be represented, but not necessarily participate, and not all elements of society will rule. Under foundationalism, there will be execution of laws, as there must be, but bureaucracy will be sharply limited and will be strictly confined to executive action. Having no rulemaking ability, foundationalism will govern, not administer. General laws will address public interests, not private interests. The impact of all the central government on daily life will be massively reduced, since foundationalism does not believe in the era of history or technocratic rule, and does not believe that the central government should dictate local practice. Nevertheless, foundationalism will directly encourage virtue and discourage vice, and forbid certain especially pernicious negative behaviors, and reward or make a condition of national advancement certain positive behaviors. The foundationalist government can have limited ends, that is a light touch and a light footprint, because it is reality-based. Viewing man as an autonomous individual rejects in principle organic social bonds, but this inevitably leads to tyranny as the only way to manage a multitude of autonomous individuals. By recognizing that man is by nature a social being, can only function well in an actual society of shared customs and beliefs, direct management of society is far less necessary and thus far less intrusive. None of this implies that foundationalism will be a libertarian or minimalist government. In pursuit of its limited ends, it will have unlimited means. The modern administrative state has erased the crucial distinction in the minds of people between an intrusive government and a strong government. Modernists fail to understand that sovereigns were, before the modern era, constrained in a web of custom, which was law. In order for foundationalism to succeed, this pre-modern understanding of sovereignty is essential. But properly viewed, the state is not constrained externally. It contains within itself, as an organic growth of a virtuous society, its own constraints. So this section I'm broadly supportive of, because I've mentioned elsewhere the importance of mixed government and a return to a classical understanding of government. Laws ideally should be an expression of custom. Good laws, at least, which is what we see mentioned here. The one thing that I would pick at here a little bit is the idea that democracy is always and everywhere a problem, which again, since the term mixed constitution comes from Aristotle and Cicero, that's not the case. Aristotle had a virtuous form of that as well. This may be the confusion that I've mentioned before, where democratic decision-making processes are equated with popular sovereignty. One can have both, one can have one and not the other, or one can have neither. So, but overall, it does seem to be, this section here seems to be a shift in a direction that I'm sympathetic to. The third pillar, virtue politics. The politics of foundationalism will be the politics of virtue. This means that foundationalism entirely rejects the Enlightenment. Moral systems based on supposed emancipation, the search for equality, emotivism, and similar grounds will vanish. All mention and memory of John Rawls will be erased. Foundationalism recognizes most of all that the form of government is irrelevant if there is a complete lack of social virtue, and that while society can tolerate an inevitable lack of virtue among some people and some classes, it cannot tolerate a lack of strong virtue among the ruling classes. Without the mas maiorum, the focus on tradition, the web of virtue that supports good government, the project will fail. The incoherence of the modern philosophers will be replaced with older and proven teleological conception of man as filtered through Christianity. The government will seek to encourage virtue in the populace, but the populace, and in particular the ruling class, is the necessary repository and driver of virtue. If virtue is to permeate a society, the aim will be for society to seek the good, which is already known, though its application to new circumstances and happenings may require discernment. Virtue will be the strengthened with rigorous application of social stigma and taboo, tied in part to religion, but not wholly dependent on religion. No laws will protect any person from the effects of desirable stigmas and taboos. Quite the contrary. Emigration will be encouraged by any person who finds this unpleasant. Conversely, honors will be awarded the deserving, those who accomplish, and those who to their virtues demand by the foundational society. The foundationalists will not seek to attain perfect virtue among the populace. The foundationalist government grasps that human beings, who they are, some limited amount of vice is inevitable, especially among the lower orders of society. The intent will be to dampen and limit vice through appropriation of virtue and stigma of vice, coupled with legal penalties for virtue where appropriate. Culture and law will work hand in hand to maximize, not perfect, virtue. So, again, I'm in favor of virtue politics, the idea of a society that rewards virtuous behavior. So again, in general, I'm mostly on board with this third pillar, though I've read this before, and this isn't really answered, at least to my knowledge, later here or elsewhere. This seems to be a narrowly reductionist view of the Enlightenment and the problems that develop from it. So just briefly, I'll reiterate my problem with the changing in thinking in the Enlightenment. So beginning with Machiavelli, we have the idea that we ought to do what is expedient rather than what is truly good. This attitude informs the scientific outlook from Francis Bacon, who then wrote On the New Knowledge, the New Method, where he cites Machiavelli precisely as saying his attitude is now our attitude. And so this attitude of convenience and expediency is ultimately rooted in a change in political thought in Machiavelli, and then a change in the way we think about nature with the father of the scientific revolution. And then furthermore, the tearing apart of social bonds is the result of the commodification of much of life. The term cash nexus, which we often hear associated with Marxists, was in fact actually coined by a reactionary. It was coined by, he wrote Carlyle. Thomas, and Marx, of course, took that up. Now, all of these I've talked about at length elsewhere. So again, I guess a lot like Charles, I'm not going to belabor the point too much, but I don't think he's removed it, so far explicitly as stated. He hasn't removed nearly enough of the Enlightenment, I believe, to make this possible. The fourth pillar, sex role realism. The family, man, woman, and children is the bedrock of all human societies. Restoring a realistic understanding of the role of men and women in society is necessary for any society to flourish. The crucial fact about men and women in society is that they are and must be partners, that women cannot do everything that a man can do, and man cannot do everything a woman can do, and that even when each sex can do what the other can do, usually cannot do it as well. Does not make one sex subordinate, but without recognizing and honoring this basic fact of different competencies, no society can operate for long. Foundationalism is explicitly anti-feminist. It regards the feminine as one of the two essentials of humanity. It regards feminism as a destructive distortion. A return to traditional sex roles, which were not at all the fictional oppression we are told they were, is both desirable and necessary. The crucial truth is that men drive a society forward while women bind a society together. So it will always be any successful society, and any society that attempts to contradict truth will only find its own destruction. Pretending that women and women are interchangeable destroys not only the family, but achievement. Okay, look, this is what I was talking about earlier, guys. Why are men and women treated, as well as other groups of people, as interchangeable? That is itself under the pressure of market forces in order to have fungible commodity exchanges, and humans are not treated as a commodity, and industrial civilization in order to make sure that we have just the right cogs to fit in if one cog breaks. Men seek glory, power, and dominance. This is why almost everything great in human history has been achieved by men. What women do is in some ways more important, but it will never be as visible. Women do not, unless given advantages, advance in hierarchy through competition. But the vast majority of women lack the drives necessary. In Western countries, the usual structure for well over 1,000 years until the Left Project made the organic relationship a target has been partnership between men and women, where each is supreme in one sphere of family life, containing a larger family web, consults the other. Women indeed hold up half the sky, but their role in its nature is inward-facing, and a man is outward-facing. In the West, there has never been any equivalent of the Eastern approach typified by Purdah, the separation and seclusion of women driven by defective religious or cultural imperatives that are the mirror image of feminism, nor under foundationalism will there be very different roles for men and women. Well, I mean, this is strictly speaking not true. The Greeks and the Romans, at various times had situations like this. In ancient Greece and Rome, if a woman didn't go out completely covered, she was considered a prostitute. And it's true that you could say, well, the Persians were more extreme, and even Plutarch comments on this. But again, if you compare what they share in common versus what we have today in the modern West, almost anybody looking back from the modern West would say the Greeks and the Persians had far more in common in their attitudes than they would with us today. And it's unclear to me what it means, but they will be very different roles. Okay, so there's that. Neither men nor women will be allowed to freely choose the path they want. Foundationalism does not seek to implement fantasies of autonomy. Social and legal compulsion will require each to make choices that benefit family and society. Women will not be permitted to choose career over family without significant penalties and disadvantages that hamper progress along such a path. Men will not be permitted to choose not to have a family or to fail to provide and protect their family without significant penalties. In other words, society will reflect the natural division of sexes regardless of whether some people in society would prefer to make some other choice, whether because of their outright or nature, excessive focus on self, or because of ideology. No-fault divorce will be banned. Adultery will be socially punished and result in legal disabilities. Modern technology that erodes healthy relationships between men and women, from Tinder to online pornography, will be rigorously suppressed. Well, I do wonder if the pill and condoms will be rigorously suppressed. So we'll have to see what that does, because that does a lot more than Tinder does to upset the apple cart on this front. The goal across all of society is to return to a natural partnership between men and women. This is very much not a siloed partnership where the man and woman each operate completely separately in pursuit of a unified goal. Instead, there is a necessary overlap. A woman advises her husband in his role outside the home, and the husband assists his wife in his role inside the home, in particular with children, especially with boys as they come of age, but also simple relief of drudgery that characterizes much household work. But human nature dictates that those spheres and roles be different. So there's actually a lot to be said here. The first thing is, what's conspicuous by its absence is the most important role that women play in a society, and that they give rise to the next generation, which generally in the past took up all of their lives, because even older women who were past the age of childbearing couldn't opt out of this because they had to instruct the younger women on how to do all this, because the younger women, being younger, don't have any experience in doing this. And I think this is what I'll say is this: for those of us that want a more traditional way of life, a more traditional society, what we know, it's very simple. We know that prior to modern industrial civilization, women were tied to what I call the child economy. All the economic activity and social activity necessary for having children, for providing children with food and clothes. Well, after a certain point, education of boys was given over to the men. This whole economy, if you will, was done by women, and they couldn't opt out, because if they did, society would die. And we just know this to be the case because our society's dying. We've opted out of it, and all prior societies didn't do this. So I guess what's again conspicuous by its absence is a failure to realize that. Because one uncharitable reading could be that this is just subjugation of women for its own sake, without any goal being directed at. And it would seem that if we're going to use teleology, the obvious goal that such a subordination would be directed to would be to childbearing and child rearing. So mixed. I'm mixed. I mean, I'm in favor of his strong defense of biological essentialism, but I don't know if I completely agree with where he goes from there. I think some things are conspicuous by their absence. The fifth pillar: the subordination of economics to politics. Foundationalism honors private property as the basis of a free society and assumes that most free exchanges are to be unfettered by any government intrusion. Well, I'll just have to say this here, guys. This is actually a very Enlightenment way of thinking. Prior to John Locke, you're not going to find very many people articulating this view of the rights of property and a free society and the state's relationship to it. So again, I don't think enough of the Enlightenment has been questioned. There are certain elements that are disliked, but also there are other elements of the Enlightenment that are still harming us that, at least in this particular manifestation, Charles promises there'll be a book written later, maybe he'll deal with it there, that are not being dealt with. Foundationalism is not distributism. It knows that concentrations of economic power are inherently corrosive and to be prevented by, and if necessary, shattered by direct government action. In no circumstances will a conflict between virtue and the free market be resolved in favor of the latter. In all instances, political choice will dictate the limits of economic choice. Based, not much to say there. I mean, I agree with that. The specifics of our economic system are not a major concern of foundationalism. Certainly, any economic action based on unreality or ideology will be rejected, and the fake work that currently makes up much of our economy will be eliminated. But whether we need a gold standard or what is to be the fractional banking ratio and under what circumstances government may be used to jog economic activity are strictly practical concerns to be addressed as necessary, not as a matter of abstract principle. Central planning will be regarded with great suspicion, however, as tending not only to not be effective, but much more important, to grow government and to cause it to interfere in matters not of its concern. Consumerism will strongly be discouraged, including by the imposition of stiff tariffs on foreign goods, contributing to consumerism. Work will be directed to the production of goods and services with positive value. Rent seeking through manipulation of government or corporate structures will be rigorously discouraged through disincentives, including criminal penalties. Existing fortunes gained through rent seeking or any who has materially supported destructive or evil causes will be wholly confiscated by the state. Again, based. Not much to say there. The foundationalist state is aware that the achievements that flow from a successful state, especially one with unparalleled scientific achievement, lead to wealth. And that wealth by itself, and when greater wealth appears achievable, frequently undermines virtue. There is no solution for this but a combination of social structures and the offering of a frontier so that wealth is directed towards outward to achievement as much as possible. Work antithetical to societal flourishing will be forbidden or strongly discouraged. Work in areas of limited value, which currently absorbs a grossly excessive portion of our intellectual energy, including law and financial engineering, will also be sharply curbed. We cannot achieve it if our brightest minds waste their talents. So I think this actually is doing a lot of work. And what I'll say is, okay, so I agree with Charles that wealth leads to vice. But then here's the thing is, so one can come to two conclusions here. One could come to a conclusion, let's build a social order in which the accumulation of wealth is either capped or made difficult or prevented. We see this in the Old Testament, specifically in the book of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, where we hear about the Jubilee and Sabbath years, where wealth is essentially redistributed, primarily in case of land, where if you buy land, it goes back to the original owner. And so you can't have these vast latifundias that exploit the people, rather than a unlimited accumulation of wealth. Because if you continue the accumulation of wealth, we don't really have a good track record of correcting for vice. Because we could say, well, you could just go explore the Americas. Yeah, but remember who drove westward expansion first across the Atlantic Ocean and then across the American continent? Well, a lot of the mountebanks and scoundrels. I mean, look at Cortez. Look at Pizarro. These are mountebanks. Look at many of the men on the U.S. frontier. Many of them were debtors or criminals who were running away from the regulated life of Eastern society. So these are not really the most virtuous men that are pushing the boundaries forward towards a new society. And again, I think if we look at the Bible, and I think Charles would agree that we should start with the Bible, the answer to wealth accumulation is to create systems that prevent it. For example, read Leviticus chapter 25, where Moses goes into detail about the Jubilee and Sabbath years. 16, the sixth pillar, intermediary institutions. Given the limited rule of government and the foundational state, the implementation of virtue as well as education in virtue must occur on the local level, and primarily through rebuilt intermediary institutions, which beyond virtue also strengthen the social web. Schools, churches, clubs, unions, and myriads of other groups will be directly encouraged and strengthened and rewarded. Foundationalism will of necessity be a high trust, not a low trust society. Differences among people will not of themselves be encouraged, rewarded, or valued. Based. A lot of this is what we would call third places you go that aren't home or work. And it's the lack of, to even have intermediary social interactions, we have to have third places to meet at. That can include a church, a club, so on and so on. So the idea that these have a value in themselves and ought to be protected and deserved is, again, a good thing. The seventh pillar, subsidiarity. Local interests will be looked after by local people. There will be no national laws on the environment or on discrimination, on guns, on education, or on any other vast majority of topics. Federal legislation, and therefore the administrative state, now covers. Many types of action will not occur at any level of government. All charitable aid will be taken out of the hands of government and given to private organizations who will be tasked with using that aid to reward virtue and punish vice. Yes, this will result in severe restrictions on autonomy for the recipients. That's a feature, not a bug. But it will also result in the ability for most of the poor to retain their dignity, especially if coupled with their political changes. Government action with respect to the poor will be restricted to assisting the poor to lift themselves out of poverty. Very large and expensive projects that require national coordination will, however, be executed by the central government. These include substantial investments in grand public works, including both earthbound and in space. The latter will be implemented both as an economic matter to obtain potentially desirable resources and as a social matter to increase the prestige and glory of the nation, which is a public interest that binds the people together. So here, I mean, again, in principle, the concept of the principle of subsidiarity is that problems ought to be solved at the level at which they arise. That doesn't necessarily mean there can't be higher authority oversight. It just means that at the level the problem occurs, at least as described in Catholic social teaching, and I think broadly speaking, subsidiarity as it has entered our lexicon has derived from Catholic social teaching, is that. But then the question is it too extreme to say that the state can't have a say? I think it's a little impractical, because if the state has this controlling interest, it can certainly make itself felt, especially if there's a complete total failure. One could envision, for example, a portion of a country going through a famine, and at the level of subsidiarity, it just can't solve it itself. Or maybe you have, like in much parts of the Pacific Northwest, a huge drug problem, which, yeah, personal responsibility is good, but to break the habit of drugs, you have to have people going out of their way to help you quit, because it's very difficult to quit once you're inside that cycle. And so I think it's a little too laissez-faire for me, as well as the fact, I was just mentioning economics. Let's go back to Leviticus, right? In Leviticus, God says to Israel, there will be no poor in the land of Israel. Why? Well, because of all these debt forgiveness laws, because of land redistribution laws. The idea that the poor are just going to bootstrap themselves is not actually found in the Bible. The idea in the Bible is that you create an economic order that prevents the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few. For example, if you want to have a stock villain who, is used, it's the rich man. When Nathan wants to convict David of sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, he tells the story about a rich man. James has a lot to say about rich men. So I think that, subsidiarity is on the right track. I think that saying the state can't get involved at all, the federal government can't get involved at all, is a little too strong. I think what I'd want to say is if it can't be solved at the level the crisis arises, and then also what is the actual appropriate response to charity, specifically from a biblical economic perspective. Those are two concerns that I would have. The eighth pillar, hierarchy and order. Foundationalism recognizes that in all areas of life, hierarchies are both natural and desirable. In no instance will hierarchy be seen as an undesirable oppression. Foundationalism is a movement within an elite, but not of the elites. Foundational society will be one of order, but not because it is a police state. Quite the contrary, order will result from a combination of political structures and the reborn virtue of the populace. If enforcement must be widespread, the society, or at least a part of the society, is failing. Crimes will be limited to crimes that are malum in se, no malum probatorium, or prohibitum crime will exist, although civil penalties, fines, and abilities will be implemented for violation of what few regulations exist. Capital punishment will be imposed for major crimes and will be swiftly implemented. For non-capital crimes, corporal punishment will be the default rather than imprisonment. So here, this I think is a limitation of the way foundationalism is being expressed. Again, if you want to be uncharitable, and there's many on the left that would be, and frankly many normies that probably wouldn't know better, would view this as just an appeal for authority for its own sake, because it's not really made apparently clear what goal is being striven for. Now, we read at the beginning of this that such a goal was beyond the scope of foundationalism up to a point. Okay, well, that might be a self-limiting factor then, that I would think might need to be considered in the future. As far as not having a lot of prisons, again, based. That's what we find in the Old Testament. There was either corporal or capital punishments in ancient Israel, and therefore there weren't a lot of prisons, and there was no prison population. The ninth pillar, Christian religion. Foundationalism does not offer an ideology. Transcendence is not offered through the state, but every sound society must have an impeller to virtue and to achievement, and a mechanism for transcendence. Religion, though itself an ideology of sorts, can be one of these impellers, achieving virtue in the people, both the ruling classes and the masses, though especially the former, along with thriving accomplishments that will echo down the ages of man, are among the ends of foundationalism, and right religion is a key component of both. Only one religion, Christianity, has ever been associated with success in both areas. Okay, let's see here. Okay, let's look at this. Virtue in the ruling classes and the masses, and then accomplishments that will echo down the ages of man. I'm just hearing somebody, from the dissonant pagan crowd or the Bapsphere saying, "What about ancient Rome? What about the Greeks?" Well, I think in some extent, since virtue ethics, and Aristotle was referred to at the very beginning of this, Charles would have to admit, yeah, the ancient Greeks and Romans did a lot in that regard. Maybe not to the same degree that he would like. Obviously, they didn't precipitate the Great Divergence in 1500. That was, Western Christendom. But I don't think he wants to say I don't think he would say that it's the Great Divergence or bust. I think we could also say that certain Near Eastern societies, certain Chinese periods also give us this sort of world historical set of accomplishments. And again, let's go back to Oswald Spengler, right? He's sort of the official historian of the dissident right, unofficially. He would agree that, the Orient and the Near East and parts of Africa like Egypt and Carthage have achieved great successes throughout history. So again, unless you want to be super, super specific, I don't think that's necessarily true. And it's true, which is a bonus. Therefore, Christianity will be the officially favored religion in the foundational state, replacing the great heresy of modernism, our currently officially favored religion. The state's overarching goal in favoring Christianity will be to seek the common good and realistic amount of virtue and flourishing. The society's standards of virtue will not emerge from purely confessional basis, but most of those standards will be derived from Christianity. Christianity will be explicitly preferred, in part because on average, Christian beliefs lead to the best outcomes for state and society. For example, teachers in any state-supported lower school or high school will be required to be practicing Christians. Just as now they are effectively required to be practitioners of the GH. And Christians will, all else being equal, receive state preferment as well as, no doubt, preferment in the private sphere for jobs to social status. Personal advancement in the state and society will thus be certainly benefited from conversion to Christianity. It might be objected that the result will often be Christians in name only, but that's fine. The goal is to weld together a society and most of all the ruling class. And while there will always be a variability of belief over time, a strongly dominant religion will do the welding, and that welding will lead to an increase in devout belief in a virtuous circle. But the foundationalist state is not a policer of the practice of belief. Rather, it will encourage and incentivize moral behavior with punishments when necessary, not of disbelief, but of actions that corrupt virtue. Thus, it will forbid most divorce, not because it is a sin, but because it destroys society. It will frown on adultery and homosexual acts and disincentivize both, but not criminalize either. It will punish graft, theft, and sharp practice. The unfettered free market will no longer be thought of as some special good or moral in itself. Okay, that's based. Gambling will be mostly illegal. There will be no lotteries. The state will corral and cur prostitution. It will flog pornographers and will execute abortionists and other murderers, and so forth, an organic development that will depend on what can be accomplished at any given point while maintaining a proper balance of costs and benefits. At the same time, freedom of religion will for all be allowed to the extent not actually in contradiction with virtue. Thus, any non-pernicious religion, any religion that is not a proxy or bridgehead for external enemies of state or society, will be permitted freedom of worship without any attempt to make worship difficult, such as Islam has always imposed on Christianity in the lands it has temporarily conquered. Well, it's still holding those lands, except those in Spain and Sicily, so temporary is doing a lot of work here too. Paganism and polytheism will be allowed and even preferred to the extent that virtue is their focus. Naturally, whole pernicious belief systems such as Satanism will be directly suppressed. Open atheism will be strongly discouraged and socially anathema. Okay, well, what it seems to me, right? Okay, if we're gonna, again, I think this section can be open to the same uncharitable reading. What is the common thing that binds people together except this kind of imposition of force and order itself? Now, the way that I think you can make sense of this is, C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man speaks of the Tao, this sort of universal moral principle of virtue that can be found across all societies. I think it would have been very helpful if Charles had actually opened this entire thing up with C.S. Lewis's The Tao and said that what foundationalism will protect is the Tao. That would have done a lot of work and helped explain, because again, for this to make sense, I think what he has to be talking about is C.S. Lewis's The Tao. Because again, he's not eliminating non-Christian religions per se. That might not be immediately apparent to people. So I think that if he hasn't already written the book, it might be helpful to bring up C.S. Lewis and the Tao. The 10th pillar, high culture. Superior society cannot exist without an excellent high culture. High culture strengthens the moral fiber of the ruling class. It is also a crucial political role in binding all levels of society together. The goal of art under foundationalism will be a form of emotional resonance, where all sectors and levels of society feel they have something in common that ties them together and which impels to virtue. In foundationalism, art will not be a set of rigid beliefs, an aesthetic canon for the elite, as is the art of modernism. It will instead, like governance, be an organic new thing based on the wisdom of the past, intertwined with all the people high and low. True and excessive attachment to high culture can lead to exaltation of luxury and thence to decadence, but this is a maintenance problem. No society can long exist, much less be a strong society, without a unifying component of the spiritual, in a broader sense than simply religious, that offers the society a heroic narrative. High art of all types, in particular architecture, something to be seen and honored by all, provides that unifying concept. The upper orders will be expected to exuberantly patronize high art, keeping in mind Aristotle's thoughts on magnanimity. I believe what Charles is referring to here is Aristotle says a magnanimous man is the one who spends money on things that are beautiful but without use. And by use, Aristotle means practical use, which is based. But I think that might conflict with certain ideas about the usefulness or efficiency of life under the guise of the machine, which, again, we've already talked about before, so I won't reiterate that too much. Artists will work in cooperation with the pillars of society, state, and private, rather than being destructive agents of the left, as they mostly have been for the past century. High architecture in particular, that of grand buildings, a bridge between God and man, and a sinew binding state and people. The ruling class and the masses. Low architecture, that of daily living and daily use, is key to satisfaction in the life of a populace. Again, based. A good example of this coming from a left-wing author would be the works of James Howard Kunstler, who, if you watch me, you know that I am a fan of him, mostly for his writings on collapse, but he actually got started writing about how ugly modern architecture is and how suburbia and urban landscapes are hellscapes. So I'm going to check that out too then. Thus, a coherent and uplifting architecture. Oh, I read that. It is frozen music. Design great architecture and you build a key component in building a society together through its role in offering a common art and through that a common culture. Art and architecture will be classical in the sense that classical traditions can express any meaning desired in a variety of languages and offer beauty and continuity along with enough originality to prevent seeming calcified. Foundationalism has no need to create anything that is new, though some organically developing novelty is expected. Again, classical tradition based. The 11th pillar, techno-optimism. Yeah, I'll have a lot to say about this, guys. Foundationalism does not idolize agrarianism. The rural life and culture has its place, and nature and its forms influence good architecture, but high culture and the drive to create a successful society always revolves around cities, and therefore technology. Foundationalism strives to offer a goal for, an outlet for, an inspiration for human aspiration, and rural life cannot build spaceports aside from today not occupying the daily life of any significant percentage of the population. Technological striving will be demanded and therefore honored. Well, again, let's bring this back into focus to the biblical worldview. If anybody here remembers my first conversation with Derek Jensen, and he's been a semi-regular guest since then, I mentioned that the Bible begins and ends with the destruction of a city, or with the cities in a negative sense. It begins with Cain building the first city, and even someone as, quote, hard-nosed and pragmatic as John Calvin admits that he built the city because he was afraid of being killed by those who would avenge the blood of Abel. And we also see that Babylon is destroyed at the end of the Bible. But you could say, well, Christ redeems the city in a certain regard. And yes, that's true. I think one obvious reading of that is living in a city is not sinful per se. But the idea that cities are this unalloyed good that we live in and we should build an urban society, I think is a little more dubious, especially in light of biblical norms, where in many cases city life is identified with empire and vice. At the same time, foundationalism rejects the disillusional belief in technology as deus ex machina. The singularity will never arrive, nor will strong artificial intelligence. Okay, that's based. I think we even talked about that a little bit. Such ideas are distractions, eschatological fantasies that harm human flourishing. A possible objection is that technology is inherently anti-human, tending to atomize society and family, destroying the unchosen bonds and intermediary institutions that bind any competent society. Yeah, that's exactly the problem with technology. This is accurate up to a point, but the answer is not to pretend that we can all live in the Shire or achieve a stable post-technological society. The answer is to make man the master of technology, not technology the master of man, and to deprecate technology that delivers autonomic individualism. We choose itemization, is not forced on us. When technology appeals to the worst angels of our nature, societal structures are the solution, not pretending we can return the genie to the bottle. Well, again, not to reiterate, this whole paragraph was the focus of our discussion. But I will say that it is inherent to technology because it seeks to reduce us to a cog, whether we like it or not. And the more we rely on it, the more of a cog we become, which is justified politically as what he would call autonomic individualism. And then the idea of, well, should we build a post-technological society? Well, I think the real question is, will a post-technological society be thrust upon us by conditions? So, yeah, if you want to hear more about this 11th pillar, you can definitely watch Charles and I's discussion about that. The 12th pillar, nationalism, not globalism. Foundationalism is a system for the West. It is unlikely to work as well for any other society, although certain elements of it could benefit all Western civilizations. Okay, maybe this hurts my C.S. Lewis analogy, because if we run with C.S. Lewis in the Tao, then yes, foundationalism could be applied to all cultures, because that sense of virtue that's being appealed to is present to varying degrees in all cultures. At least that's what C.S. Lewis argues, and I think that's the best way to understand what Charles is saying, unless he explains in more detail elsewhere beyond the scope of this essay. Its specific focus is America, on the lands where America now is, give or take. Within that area, foundationalism will be the spine of the nation, and that nation will stand apart from other nations with no interest in other nations beyond trade and useful articles and decent mutual respect for each other's interests, combined with willingness to defend these interests if threatened. Immigration will only be permitted in extremely limited amounts and only if culturally compatible individuals with specific worthwhile skills. All illegal immigrants and legal immigrants of the past several decades not culturally compatible would be deported to their countries of origin. Well, if he's speaking about the United States here, yeah, I mean, the United States could easily just withdraw into itself and, not be much bothered by the rest of the world. That might be harder for other countries, in which case, it'd be harder for European countries, for example. In foreign policy, the only relevant criterion will be the ends of the nation, although since foundationalism will explicitly prefer Christianity, the interests of Christians as Christians outside the country, and to some extent also of Jews, will be considered an interest of the nation. The foundationalist state will implement an aggressive industrial policy tailored to the benefit of the populace, meaning workers, not parasitic elite. In short, globalism in its current meaning will be despised and treated with contempt. Dual citizenship will not be permitted. Any citizen who views himself as a global citizen, not a citizen of the nation, will be made to leave his assets. Will be made to leave while his assets stay behind. Well, here's the thing, right? So we read up here. And that nation will stand apart from other nations with no interest in other nations beyond trade and useful articles. That doesn't really seem to square with what we see here, where there's also interest in Christians in other nations and Jews in other nations, which means it has potentially expansionist or confrontational interests in other nations. That doesn't seem to be entirely clear to me. Maybe there's a way to reconcile them. but it looks like this first paragraph is working at contra purposes to the second paragraph. Before I get to the path, there was something else that I totally forgot to mention. Where was it? It was in his section on gender, sex role realism. I wanted to point this out before I forget. He says, women will not be permitted to choose a career over family without significant penalties and disadvantages that hamper. Men will not be permitted to choose not to have a family or to fail and provide and protect their family without significant penalties. So I think this is going to run into some trouble. So this part is fine, assuming you've already started a family, you've chosen a set of obligations that you can't easily get your way out of. But here's the problem, because he seems to think that this attitude is the result of where did he say this later? A kind of laziness or viciousness. But let's look at like Sir Isaac Newton, right? He for all purposes, all we know, and all the evidence, died a virgin. He never was with a woman. Would anybody say that the life of Sir Isaac Newton was wasted or harmful to the British people? I don't think so. Furthermore, we have within the Christian teaching, Christ in Matthew 19 and Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 makes certain claims about a celibate life within the church. Again, I'm not saying that's for everyone. I wouldn't even say it's something that should be turned into a organizational subsection like the Catholic Church does with monastic orders. But I also think this is a bit extreme in the opposite direction. I mean, we don't want to mandate clerical celibacy, but by the same time, I don't think we want to mandate that all men get married. And I think you could plausibly argue there needs to be some sort of good justification for one choice of life over another. But I just don't think that. I think this statement is worded too strongly. I think it assumes there could be no possible justification. And as Christians, and I know Charles is a Christian as well, we know that that's not strictly speaking the case. So before I forgot that, I wanted to do that. And now we're going to end this whole thing, the path. How is foundationalism to be accomplished? Not easily, and not without the world first being broken and then remade. The first requiem is smashing and inevitably discarding our current system. That is a culture and political dominance of the left, the poison of the modern age. This, when done, will destroy forever the philosophical dominance of autonomic individualism. When that is successfully accomplished, the ground will be cleared for foundationalism. If that is not successfully accomplished, there's no point in talking about worthwhile future for human flourishing. The future will instead be a sickly random walk into the distant future, and perhaps be no future at all if man extinguishes himself. Achieving foundationalism will inevitably occur in part by first passing through chaos and violence. Through chaos and violence will be steps forward and steps backward, but if our leaders are bold men informed by foundationalism, more steps will be made forward than backward. But if foundationalism is truly a system based in reality, it will succeed in its goals. Success breeds success, resulting in that public opinion will, to the extent that our early turn to foundationalism, decisively turn in that direction. While foundationalism does not take its direction from public opinion, it realizes that a society must, to a large extent, reflect public opinion, and that in a modern technological society, opinion will always be widely and quickly formed. The system, therefore, will lead from above, must also grow organically from below, and become a living thing, strong and flexible, able to face the future with confidence and audacity and determination. This is the way. So what I'll say here is I think that in one of my earlier videos, I think it was the Modem Man, where I talk about Jacques Ellul. Jacques Ellul mentions that the technological organism, for lack of a better word, is not according to anything we find in nature, not organic life and not inorganic life, say things like minerals or inorganic materials itself, processes that go on. The tension we've had over the last 200 years, which is being resolved in the favor of the machine, is that organic life and inorganic processes that are still natural they cannot really coexist with technology on a whole variety of levels, from resource extraction to the maintenance of the technological capital structure to its effects on humans and animal life. So I think that the last 200 years are showing pretty conclusively that these two things cannot really be reconciled. One or the other must win. And of course, since technology is itself a synthetic, hyper-real imposition on the environment and human life as a whole, it will be the one that fails because it's dependent on the environment and the earth that it lives on and the resources it extracts, not the earth on it. So I think that is a one problem. The other problem is the attribution of autonomic individualism to a set of bad beliefs in the Enlightenment. I mean, it is, but is it merely reducible to a set of bad beliefs in the Enlightenment? No, I don't think so. Because again, if we go back, we have a shift in the way we think about politics with Machiavelli. That encourages a shift in the way we think about nature with Bacon. And then that continues to degrade virtue. Virtue. Don't do what's right, guys. Do what's expedient. And Machiavelli's The Mandrakes gets into this as a sort of practical advice on how to do that. And that's the entire drive of science. Do what is expedient, not what's right. And then, of course, you have the political manifestations of this. And then you have the development of ideologies that seek to facilitate this drive, whether it's capitalism or communism. They both seek to facilitate this technological society, and in so doing, deconstruct organic human networks. The other thing is, if we have a violent conflagration that destroys this civilization, which Charles seems to think will happen, and I think will happen, you don't just start over and rebuild all your capital structures. For example, Russia still hasn't fully recovered from the level of collapse of the Soviet Union, and that was relatively peaceful. Imagine a violent, bloody collapse, and then trying to rebuild a civilization capable of putting a man into low Earth orbit. I mean, that's going to take a long time if it happens at all. And this all depends on your idea of how sustainable technology is. And again, we've already discussed that. So I hope everyone that was interesting and entertaining. Of course, I also tried a different screen presentation. You guys can all tell me in the chat if you thought that was good or not. And yeah, so let's see what we have in the chat. Minoan. Yeah, he doesn't mention birth control that I've seen. Yeah, I mean, if you don't work on that, you're never going to have a traditional social rules. Minoan, I'm not sure why he spends time addressing the drudgery of housework. Male work is often drudgery. Perhaps it's PR to get women on board with foundationalism. Maybe. I know. Well, it's funny, right? The idea that housework is drudgery is actually from, what was it, second wave feminists like, Betty Friedan and, I'm trying to think of the French feminist. She wrote The Second Sex. Let's see here. Simone Beauvoir. Yeah. So. All right, everyone. I'm a little over the hour limit, but I thought it would be interesting to try something a little different than a normal presentation and engage constructively with other people's work. This wasn't anything like Moldbug. I wasn't trying to completely deconstruct. That's for Moldbug. So after the Trent Affair in 1862, Seward, who was later famous for buying Alaska in 1867, told Lincoln he should go to war with Britain. And Lincoln told him, one war at a time, Seward, one war at a time. So right now, since I'm going after Moldbug, it's just one war at a time, guys. Not that I plan on turning those guns on Charles at any point in the future, but just that Moldbug is limiting my attention for the moment. It's Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing off.